Hello everyone, and welcome back to the 9th episode of Death Row Executions. Today's story is on Robert Alton Harris, who was the first person in California to be executed since executions were reinstated in 1976. Robert was born on January 15, 1953 in North Carolina to Kenneth and Evelyn Harris. His father was in the Army and served in World War II, but was anything but an honest living man. Kenneth and Evelyn were both alcoholics, and Kenneth was very abusive. It has been documented that Robert was born 3 months premature because Kenneth kicked Evelyn in the abdomen, causing her to go into labor. Not only that, Robert was born with fetal alcohol syndrome. Going along with the same reoccurring theme with a lot of convicted murderers on death row, Kenneth got the worst of the abuse from his father because he believed that Robert was not biologically his. The Harris family eventually ended up moving to California in 1962 following Kenneth's discharge from the Army, and just the next year, he was arrested and sent to jail for 18 months for sexually abusing his daughters. Doesn't seem like a long time to me. And the year after that, in 1964, he was jailed again for sexually abusing his daughters. I know this story is supposed to be about Robert, but I feel like his father was just a screwed up person, and Robert was doomed from birth. I don't see how someone can only be sent to jail for 18 months for sexually abusing multiple daughters. This man had 9 kids altogether and was horrible to them all. But back to Robert. At the age of 2, Robert had a broken jaw after his father punched him, most likely in a drunken rage. Also, his father would play this game with all of his siblings and tell them that they had 30 minutes to go outside and hide, and Kenneth would get a loaded gun, go outside and shoot them down like animals, which is pretty sadistic if you ask me, and I am truly confused as to where Child Protective Services were. Robert's earliest run-in with the law was at the age of 10, and by 13, he was already serving time in a juvenile detention center for stealing a car. He only spent 4 months in juvie, but while locked up, he was repeatedly raped and molested. A year after being released, at the young age of 14, Robert's mother abandoned him and left him alone to fend for himself. She actually ended up dying not too long after that by drinking and smoking her way to death. Robert was able to make his way to Oklahoma to live with a brother and sister. Unfortunately, soon after he made it, he stole a car and made his way to Florida, which he eventually got arrested for and spent time at a juvenile detention center up until he was 19 and no longer able to stay at that center. He was sent back to California, and just a year after being released at the age of 20, he got married and had a son by the name of Robert Jr. A year later, in 1975, he moved to a trailer park near his brother, and one day he ended up killing his brother's roommate by beating him to death and was charged with voluntary manslaughter because his defense was that he was trying to protect the victim's wife. But it was later found that he was lying and made that up. For this crime, he served his time at San Luis Obispo and was able to get paroled in 1978. So he was only in prison for just a few years on a murder that he meant to commit. This story reminds me of my first story on Jimmy Lee Gray and how he murdered a 16-year-old, spent only a few years in prison, was paroled, and while on parole, killed again. So the same year that Robert was on parole, he and his brother Daniel Marcus Harris decided that they were going to commit a crime together. Robert was 25 and his brother Daniel was just 18 years old. On July 2nd, Daniel Harris stole 2 guns from a neighbor's house, and he and his brother spent the next 2 days buying ammunition and practicing their shooting and robbery plans. On July 5th, 1978, at about 10:30 in the morning, Robert and his brother left their home and drove to a fast food restaurant where they noticed 2 young boys in a car and decided that they were going to steal their car. The 2 boys were John Majewski and Michael Baker, and they were best friends who were eating hamburgers and had planned to go fishing later that day to celebrate John's new driver's license. Robert held the 2 young boys at gunpoint with a 9mm pistol and forced them to drive until they reached an isolated area at Miramar Lake. Robert was in the car with the young boys, while Robert's brother Daniel followed the car in a 1963 Ford. Robert told the boys that they would not be hurt and they only needed the car for a bank robbery. Once they made it to the lake, Robert forced both boys to kneel. While kneeling, the boys began to cry and pray. Robert replied by telling them, "Quit crying and die like men." He proceeded to then shoot the boys multiple times. He then returned to their green Ford LTD and finished eating their half-eaten hamburgers. While Robert and Daniel were eating the leftover food, Robert was boasting about the killings. At around 11:45 is when the boys were killed, and Robert drove the stolen car back home while his Daniel brother met him there. Later that day, Robert and his brother drove the stolen car to a bank nearby, put on ski masks, and were able to steal about $2,000 in cash. The brothers left the bank by 12:30 p.m. and drove the getaway car back to their home and parked it in the garage. Unbeknownst to the brothers, an eyewitness had followed Robert and his brother from the bank to their house and called the San Diego Police Department. By 1:00 p.m., the police had both brothers in custody. Police found 20 unfired rounds of ammo, and the clothes that they were wearing during the robbery and killings were found burning in the fireplace. One of the arresting officers was Stephen Baker. Unfortunately, Stephen Baker was the father of Michael Baker, one of the 16-year-old boys that was killed by Robert, but he did not yet know about his son's death. Robert was denying being involved in the robbery, and the police were not yet aware of the murders earlier that day. By 6:00 at night, Robert's brother, Daniel Harris, told the cops everything about the robbery and pinned everything on his brother Robert, and he eventually confessed to the murder he witnessed by his brother. Police went to the scene of the crime to verify if what Daniel was saying was true, and that is when they discovered the 2 dead teens. The next year, on March 6, 1979, Robert was convicted for 2 counts of murder in the first degree and kidnapping and was sentenced to death. His brother testified against him in court and was only charged with kidnapping and spent just 6 years in prison. For Robert Harris's last meal, he ate everything he requested, which was a 21-piece Kentucky Fried Chicken bucket, 2 large Domino pizzas, a bag of jelly beans, a 6-pack of Pepsi, and a pack of Camel cigarettes. Robert was then strapped into the gas chamber at 3:49 a.m., and a mere seconds before the execution, he got a stay of execution from Judge Harry Pregerson, and That made Robert become the first person in California to be strapped in the gas chamber and actually leave the gas chamber without being executed. It didn't last long, though, because just 2 hours later, the U.S. Supreme Court vacated the stay of execution and made a statement that no further stays shall be entered by the federal courts for Robert Alton Harris. He was later taken back to the execution chamber, and Warden Daniel Vasquez, who was the warden at San Quentin Prison at the time and carried out only 2 executions, including Robert's, with no training at all, asked Robert if he had any last words. You can be a king or a street sweeper, but everybody dances with the Grim Reaper. He misquoted a line from the 1991 film Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, which was, "You might be a king or a little street sweeper, but sooner or later, you'll dance with the Reaper." The execution order was given at 6:07 a.m., and there were 49 witnesses there for his execution. It was witnessed that he tried to mouth the words, "It's all right," and "I'm sorry." He began to take deep breaths, twitch, and convulsed, and his head snapped back and then dropped. After a few minutes, his hands relaxed, his mouth was opened, and his face was flushed, turning blue. A few minutes after that, there was one more cough and a convulsion, and he was pronounced dead at 6:21 a.m. His body was removed at 7 a.m. and was taken to a funeral home by 8:15. Robert Harris was the first execution in 25 years and died at the age of 39. Comment below and tell me what you think of this story. Many protesters felt he had a hard life and didn't deserve to be executed. Do you think it's possible to rehabilitate an adult who only knows violence and crime? Thank you for watching another episode, and I would appreciate you subscribing to the channel and growing with me. Stay safe, everybody.